Session 49第49讲，我们在讲圣约神学和时代论这两派的福音派的思想怎么看圣经历史的架构。我们做些最后的一般性的观察之后呢，就进入到圣经的不同的时代。第一段的时代是创造之约 Covenant of Creation Page 203. As this journey through the various structurings of the history of redemption progresses, 当我们进入到这个旅程来看两派甚至福音派里面不同的观点怎么让圣经的救赎历史建立一个架构的时候呢， three matters should become evident. 有三件事情是越来越明显的。First, 第一件明显的事是 It should become clear that some significant refinements have developed in more recent expressions of the dispensationalist perspective. 第一，很明显的是，在最近的几年呢，时代论的观点，他们的表述的方式就越来越细腻，做了一些的很重要的修正。Second, 第二件明显的是It should become clear that a significant point of tension exists within dispensationalism itself as it views the covenants and the dispensations as two options for structuring redemptive history. 我们会越来越明显的看见，在时代论这个运动本身有一种的紧张的状态。当他们来看约和看时代作为两个不同的观点来作为救赎历史的架构的时候，约同时代这两个观点这两个概念之间有着一种的紧张的状态的。Third, 第三件明显的是 It should become clear that a basic difference of perspective exists between the structure of redemptive history as understood by the covenant theologian and by the dispensationalist. 我们会看到圣约神学家所了解的救赎历史架构和时代论者所了解的救赎历史的架构呢，两者之间有着一个最基本的观点角度的不同的。Page 204 to 206. 第一段 The Covenant of Creation 204到206页 Covenant theology understands God's relationship to man at creation from a covenantal perspective. 圣约神学看上帝在创造的时候与人的关系是从一个约的角度来看的。Man's responsibility as created in God's image to form a culture glorifying to the Lord indicates something of the breadth of human responsibility established by creation. 人在上帝面前有一些的责任，既然人是按照神的形象造的，他必须塑造一个荣耀上主的文化。这就指出，在上帝创造的时候所设立的人的责任是非常的宽广的。The whole of the universe was to be brought into subjection to the glory of God. 人要把整个宇宙带进来，服在上帝荣耀之下。The ordinance of marriage and the institution of the Sabbath. 上帝设立婚姻的制度，还有设立的安息日 implied that man's obligation to his maker extended to every area of human activity. 这就暗示着人对他的创造主当负的责任是涵盖所有人类活动的每一个范围的。At the same time, 与此同时 a special test of probation with respect to the non-eating of the tree of the knowledge good and evil, 上帝给人一个特别的考验，就是人不可吃分辨善恶树上的果子。Focus attention on man's specific responsibility to obey the word of the Lord simply because it was the Lord's word. 这里的焦点就是人有一个特定的责任，遵行上主的话，只是因为这个就是上主的话而已。By the establishment of this all-encompassing relationship, God bound himself to man the creature. 上帝设立了这个涵盖生活一切的关系，这样子上帝就与他所创造的人 相互的连结起来了。This relationship established by creation serves as the foundational basis for understanding the whole of human history as it develops from this point. 在创造的时候，上帝所设立这个关系呢，就成为一个的基础，让我们了解从这里开始发展出去的人类的历史的全部。The epoch that corresponds to the covenant of creation, according to Old Scofield Bible, 根据老旧的史可夫圣经与创造之约相对的这个时代呢 is called the dispensation of innocency, 是被称为无罪的时代。This dispensation is described as an absolutely simple test, which ended in the judgment of the expulsion. 这个时代是一个绝对简单的考验，它是以上帝把人赶出乐园这个审判结束的。This particular dispensation receives very little elaboration in the Old Scofield Bible. 这个特别的时代在老旧的史可夫圣经里面有很少的解释。No explanation is given concerning the broader responsibilities of man created in God's image. 老旧的史可夫圣经呢，没有解释人按照上帝的形象而造有怎么样的宽广的责任。Only the reference to the simple test describes the actual character of this relationship. 史可夫圣经只指出这个简单的考验，这个就描述了神人之间的关系的具体的性质了。Such an abbreviated perspective on man's responsibilities as created. 那么对被造的人当负的责任从这个这么的狭窄的角度来看呢 eventually must have a most significant effect on the overall view of the meaning of Christianity. 这个肯定会带来很重要的效果，就是时代论者怎么来看基督教整体的意义。More recent dispensational thinking on the dispensation of innocency may be found in C.C. Ryder's Dispensationalism Today. 关于这个所谓无罪的时代，时代论有一个比较近年来的解释，可以在 Ryrie 的今天的时代论这本书可以看到。Ryrie indicates that Ryrie R-Y-R-I-E 他指出 Adam's responsibilities involved maintaining the garden and not eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. 亚当的责任包括治理伊甸园和不吃这个分辨善恶树的果子。He notes man's broader responsibility with respect to the garden. 他注意到人有一个管理这个园子的一个宽广的责任。Although he does not elaborate on the significance of this obligation, 他没有在这个管理园子的重要性上做什么的发挥。He also introduces into discussion a significant feature at this early stage that characterizes the treatment of the dispensations. Ryrie 在这里呢，也介入了一个很重要的要素，在这么早的一个阶段就已经介入到他的讨论，就让他如何处理所有的时代都带着这个色彩的。He attempts to provide scriptural limitations which bracket the particular epoch under discussion. 他试图呢为这个的时代呢用经文来做出一个界限。In this case, 在这个时代在我们考虑的这个时代呢 he sets the limits of the dispensation of innocency as Genesis 1:28 to 36. 他所做出的界限是创世纪第1章28节到第3章第6节。As shall be seen subsequently, 我们下文会看到 This effort to provide the points at which each dispensation begins and ends creates some troublesome problems for dispensational interpretation. 这种的方法要指出每一个时代在哪一点开始，哪一点结束呢？为时代论的解经呢带来一些麻烦、一些难题的。A much fuller perspective on God's relationship to man at creation is found in the notes of the Schofield Reference Bible with respect to the covenant God established with man at creation. 那么斯可夫圣经的注解里面呢，就提供一个更完整的一个观点角度来看上帝创造人的时候，他与人的关系是什么，特别是上帝在创造人的时候与人所立的约 covenant。 The New Schofield Bible 这个新的斯可夫圣经呢 capsules the substance of God's original covenant with man， 就勾画出上帝原来与人所立的约的核心意义。 The first or Edenic covenant， 第一个约或者伊甸之约 required the following responsibilities of Adam， 要求亚当要负起下列的责任。 Number one, to propagate the race， 第一，要繁殖人类。 Number two, to subdue the earth for man， 为了人的缘故治理大地，叫地服在人之下。 Number three， 第三， to have dominion over the animal creation， 统治一切受造的动物。 Number four， 第四， to care for the garden and eat its fruits and herbs， 要照顾伊甸园，吃它的果子和蔬菜。 And five， 还有第五， to abstain from eating of one tree， the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on penalty of death for disobedience， 不可吃一棵树上的果子，就是分辨善恶树的果子，若违背这个命令，惩罚是死亡。 Except for failing to mention the role of Sabbath in God's creation ordinances, this description of man's original relationship to his creator has much to commend it. 在这里，新的斯可夫圣经怎么样描述人原来与他的创造主的关系呢？除了没有提到安息日是上帝创造的典章之一以外，这里的描述是很值得赞扬的。It deals quite adequately with man's broader responsibilities. 它足够勾画出人的宽广的责任， while at the same time indicating the specific test under which man was placed at creation. 与此同时指出，在创造的时候，人要服在怎么样一个的考验之下。In comparing the dispensational treatment of the first of the dispensations with the first of the covenants, it can be said that these two perspectives actually conflict with one another. 当我们比较时代论如何处理第一个时代和第一个约的时候呢，我们不能说这两种的观点角度有什么冲突。However, man's original relationship to God finds a much fuller treatment under the dispensational analysis of the Edenic covenant than under the dispensationalist analysis of the dispensation of innocency. 但是人原来与上帝的关系呢，在伊甸之约这个时代论的分析上就更加的丰富。在时代论如何解释无罪的时代呢，就没有那么完整了。Number two, the covenant of redemption. 第二，救赎之约 pages 206 to 227， 第206到227页。Under this, the first covenant. 第一 Adam, the covenant of commencement. 亚当创始之约。Covenant theology understands the whole of history after man's fall into sin as unifying under the provisions of the covenant of redemption, or more traditionally, the covenant of grace. 圣约神学的了解是，人堕落进入最终之后，整个的人类的历史是用救赎之约，或者更加传统的名字是恩典之约所提供的救恩，作为统一这个历史的主题的。Beginning with the first promise to Adam and sin， 从上帝对在最终的亚当第一个应许开始， and continuing throughout history to the consummation of the ages， 一直走过人类的历史到世界的末了。God orders all things in view of his singular purpose of redeeming a people to himself。 上帝管理万物都因为他有一个的目的，就是要为他自己救赎他的子民。Indeed, significant substructures within this great expanse of time must be noted。 诚然的，我们在这个长远的历史里面，我们会看到一些重要的次要的结构的。The distinction between Old Covenant and New Covenant marks a major structural division within the history of redemption。 在救赎历史里面，我们看到旧约和新约之间的区别是一个重要的结构上的区分。Yet even these two great epochs relate integrally to one another。 但是虽然有旧约新约这两个伟大的时代呢，之间也有着一种的不可或缺的连结。As promise and fulfillment, as shadow and reality， 它们分别是应许和成全，是影子和实体的。God's initial words to Adam after his fall into sin appropriately may be considered in terms of the commencing of this covenant history。 我们可以说，这个约的历史是什么时候开始呢？就是当亚当堕落到最终之后，上帝向亚当所讲的头一段的话。这个我们可以说很恰当的说，就是圣约历史的开始了。In his words to the serpent, to the woman, and to the man， 上帝向蛇所讲的话，向女人讲的话和向男人讲的话呢， The Lord decrees the nature of the struggle which shall ensue in the cause of bringing man to salvation， 都指出上帝如何命定一种的斗争，就是当上帝要把人带回到救赎里面的时候，肯定会发生的一个斗争的本质是什么？ In a sweat of man's face， 男人要汗流满面 to the pain of childbirth， 女人生产要有苦楚。By the provision of a singular champion， 上帝要提供一个胜利的救赎主。God shall achieve for man a thoroughgoing redemption， 透过这一切，上帝要为人成就一个彻底的救赎。This entire program aims toward the restoration of man to the situation of blessing in which he was created originally。 这整个的救赎计划的目的，就是要使人恢复到他原来被造的时候那种的蒙福的状态。Covenantal history thus displays the unifying purposes of God in the world。 因此，圣约的历史就展示出上帝在世界中的那个统一的计划或者目标。The Scofield Bible characterizes the period which immediately follows man's fall into sin as the dispensation of conscience。 斯可夫圣经认为呢，人堕落到最终之后的那段时期是良知或者良心的时代。According to the Old Scofield Bible， 根据老旧的斯可夫圣经， man under this dispensation was responsible to do all known good, to abstain from all known evil, and to approach God through sacrifice。 根据这个老旧的斯可夫圣经，在这个时代，人的责任就是要行出所有他知道的善，避免所有他知道的罪恶，然后呢，透过献祭来到上帝的面前。Perhaps the most obviously problematic associated with this description of the state of man immediately after his fall into sin， 可能这个对人堕落到最终之后的这个状态的描述所带出最明显的问题就是 is the failure to center on God's promise concerning the provision of a redeemer as described in Genesis 3:15， 就是他没有以上帝的应许作为他的核心，上帝应许他被提供一个救赎主的，在创世纪第3章第15节，上帝描述这个救主的。创世纪第3章第15节，上帝说：“我又要叫你 和女人彼此为仇。上帝对蛇说，我要叫你和女人彼此为仇，你的后裔和女人的后裔也彼此为仇，女人的后裔要伤你的头，你要伤她的脚跟。It is not man's conscience that comes to the fore in Scripture immediately after the fall. 在圣经里，人类多了之后，最突出的不是人的良知， Instead, it is God's grace. 乃是上帝的恩典是最突出的 that promises to end the conflict against Satan on behalf of his fallen creature that characterizes the age. 是上帝的恩典作为这个时代的最重要的特点。上帝的恩典应许他要进入到一场的征战，代表他的堕落的被造的人与撒旦征战。这个是这个时代的最重要的、最突出的特点。Although not really radical enough in its revisions, 虽然新的四个福圣经的修订没有那么的彻底， The New Scofield Bible shows appropriately sensitivity to this problem. 但是呢，新的版本的确表示他对这个问题是有某个程度上的敏感的。The revised description of the dispensation of conscience introduces a reference to the first promise of redemption. 修订版怎么形容良知的时代呢？它介入了上帝第一次应许救赎这件事。It elaborates on the responsibility of man, as described in the Old Scofield Bible, to approach God through blood sacrifice, by noting that this responsibility is here instituted in prospect of the finished work of Christ. 他也在好像老旧的四个福圣经一样，他在人的责任上有所发挥。人的责任就是要透过流血的献祭来到上帝的面前。而新的四个福圣经呢，提出这个责任在这里上帝设立了，是要人展望基督将要完成的大功的。The note also alters the description of the final result of the second testing of man. 新的四个福圣经的注释也修改了第二次人受到的考验最后的结果。According to the Old Scofield Bible, 根据老旧的四个福圣经 the testing of man by his conscience resulted in the absolute depravity of man as described in Genesis 6:5. 人透过他的良知所受的考验的结果就是他完全的堕落，就正如创世纪第6章第5节所描述的。According to the New Scofield Bible, 但是根据新的四个福圣经 the quote-unquote result of this second dispensation is to be found in a promise of redemption as described in Genesis 3:15. 这个第二个时代的结果呢，就是创世纪第3章15节这个救赎的应许。Still further, 不但如此， the New Scofield Bible modifies this particular dispensation by revising the perspective on the end of this period of testing. 新的四个福圣经修改了这个时代，因为它修改了对这段考验时期的结果的观点。The Old Scofield Bible had declared that this dispensation of conscience came to an end in the judgment of the flood. 老旧的四个福圣经呢，宣告这个良知的时代在上帝用洪水审判人类的时候就结束了。But the New Scofield Bible affirms, 但是新的四个福圣经宣告 that man continued in his moral responsibility as dictated by conscience throughout succeeding ages. 新的四个福圣经宣告说，人在后来所有的时代都继续有着他的道德的责任，就是他的良心所吩咐他当尽的责任。我们下一次继续来讲这个良心时代。